We live in cities you'll never see on screen. Not very pretty, but we sure know how to run things. Living in ruins of the palace within our dreams. And you know, we're on each other's teams.
Aywa Markham Rayan, and this is episode 5 of the Vegans for Palestine podcast. Debarati is a queer, non binary feminist vegan who is currently living in India. They run a digital project that is called Brown Feminist Vegan, which is about total liberation, consistent anti oppression, and decolonial veganism. Let's hear what they have to say.
Brown Feminist Vegan is a digital project that I started back in 2020 during COVID. It's just a page on Instagram and it talks about total liberation, consistent anti-oppression, and looks at veganism through an intersectional and decolonial lens. And you can say it's like an educational page where I talk about all of these things. And this is a passion project that I run. It's completely unfunded right now, and I'm the only one doing it. And we have a community of around 12,000 people right now. And this is also a space for vegans and vegan curious folks to come to and also learn from each other. And we have a lot of conversations going on in some of the posts. And I also had the privilege of getting to collaborate with some other vegans and intersectional activists through this project. So, yeah.
So, working on this project with your understanding of intersectionality of veganism and feminism as a brown non-binary person, how does this intersectionality shape your approach to the activism and the work that you do?
So, intersectionality is really an embodied reality for many of us. Like, I'm queer, I'm non binary, neurodivergent, I live with chronic health conditions, and I'm a person of color. So, my feminism and queerness also embodies all of these realities. And in my veganism, too, I can recognize like the way I approach my vegan politics and how I have experienced it since the time I went vegan 10 years back. It's also a recognition of the way different oppressions are interconnected and how they enable each other. For example, in our feminism and in our queerness, um, many of us recognize how certain bodies of diverse genders are really considered less than in heteropatriarchal societies, and how also marginalized bodies become sites of violence, for example, trans people. So there are similar structures of oppression that are also exploiting non-human animals, where um, the violation of their bodily autonomy and their agency and the violation of their choices and their entire lives is so normalized. And historically also, the oppressor or the colonizer have always animalized the oppressed or the people that they colonize, like they have called them animals. Why? Because this human animal binary or this hierarchy is something that is really part of the oppressor's playbook. And it really helps justify violence against certain bodies and against certain lives that are not considered human enough. And people who are marginalized, um, not just by gender, but also by race, caste, disability, and so on, really experience this. So this understanding is really ingrained in all my politics, be it feminism, be it queerness, be it animal rights, because I feel it's really important to unpack this human animal binary that rationalizes oppression of both humans who are marginalized and non human animals, because animals are not afforded the same rights or the same moral consideration as humans in this hierarchy. So, in veganism intersectionality, I feel in it means like fundamentally recognizing this, without which we cannot really dismantle these interconnected systems of oppression.
And speaking of these systems of oppression, one of the I recall the very first time we talked, you addressed the topic of casteism and how that being one of the oldest forms of social stratification in India. And my understanding, it's an intricate hierarchy that's basically governing people's lives. And correct me if I'm wrong, it's particularly the Hinduism community in India, or does it also apply to the wider community overall in India? But basically, it pretty much determines people's lives, whom they marry, the kind of jobs they're entitled to, and that is also part of the politics that you advocate for and you address in your work. Um, and you don't really see that in mainstream veganism, as it really fails to address issues of race and gender and disability, as well as casteism. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how you really address it as you attempt to educate people?
Yeah, so mainstream veganism of the world, it's really Eurocentric and something of the Western world that often does not resonate with our local communities. Although the idea of animal liberation and, living in harmony with non-human animals, or living sustainably with non-human animals, and the idea of causing the least harm, this is not a new invention of the Western world. It has been very intrinsically present in how so many local and indigenous communities perceive society and live their lives, although they might not be using the language of animal rights. But there are so many practices and cultures that really recognize this philosophy of coexistence. But Western mainstream veganism is really presented like a consumer activity, and it's not rooted in animal liberation or anti-speciesism. So it's also like very capitalistic, where the focus is on brands that can drive consumer choices. And it's also very depoliticized, like it doesn't talk about interconnected oppressions around race, gender, disability, and so on. And especially in our parts of the world, also, mainstream veganism is seen like a consumer activity. And things that are part of vegan activism in the Western world are often implemented here, which doesn't work because our cultural contexts are so different, like the caste context that you mentioned. For example, there is this liberation pledge where um, if you take the liberation pledge, you don't sit and eat with others who are eating non-vegan. And in India, some activists and like some vegans have taken that pledge. But here, the context is that people of oppressed castes and indigenous folks and Muslims who are a minority community in India, they're really discriminated against by oppressor caste Hindus, and they routinely face violence for consuming meat. And food really is a means here to maintain the caste system and all of these hierarchies. So things like the Liberation Pledge, that they mimic the West without being mindful of the local context, where these kind of practices only enable discrimination against minoritized folks. And also it also alienates marginalized folks from the vegan movement as well, where they do not um, where this is not a space that takes into account their realities. Also, there are a lot of vegans who belong to marginalized communities, who have actually left a lot of vegan activist spaces because they're expected to be apolitical, and they're expected to like just talk about animal rights and not draw any connections with queer rights or caste or feminism or disability in animal rights spaces. But it's so important to understand that animal rights do not exist in vacuum. Caste, for example, where people of oppressed castes are made to do the most difficult work in the leather industry, for example, in the tanneries, that really violate all of their labor rights, and they also maintain caste oppression. And similarly, like in the meat industry as well, people who are marginalized due to caste and religion, they are doing what is considered the dirty work, handling animal bodies in what is considered their impure form or the dirty form. But in mainstream activism spaces, here you are not allowed to talk about these things. And it reminds me how some mainstream global vegan spaces are not talking about genocide or about Palestine, and they focus only on what they call conversions, like converting people to being vegan. But I don't think that is enough. We don't need conversions. What we need is transformation, and real and sustainable transformation really cannot happen without addressing all of these systemic problems and how they are so interconnected and how they enable both human and non-human animal oppression.
I recall here one of the quotes I read across your page. I think that was from a book, I think, Veganism of Color, Decentering Whiteness in Human and Non-Human Liberation by Bratik Gautam. And excuse me if I'm saying it incorrectly. But it says how casteism, speciesism conceptualizes the addition of non-human oppression as a driving force that allows casteism to continue unchecked. Under this type of speciesism, non-humans are given a value according to caste. And this is pretty much what you are really addressing with these examples. And I think I'm thinking really how your experience really growing up in India really influenced your journey towards veganism. Um, how do you address how you reconcile and connect with your vegan philosophy and the vegan activism and your background, where you grew up in, and the work that you do these days?
So I became vegan 10 years ago, and back then there was not a lot of information that was available about veganism or the movement. Like even the movement did not have this much visibility as it has today. And it was also much harder to find other vegans and connect with other vegans because social media was not how it is today. So most of the information that I found about veganism was primarily online. And so it was like from a very white vegan perspective, because those are the first pieces of knowledge that you come across. So yeah, but a lot of us had to look harder, and we sought out knowledge around intersectional veganism that really resonated with us. For example, I learned so much from Black feminist vegans like Afko and Silko, and also Christopher Sebastian, who talked about race and speciesism. So these frameworks also helped me unpack what anti-speciesism can look like in my local context. Of course, my local contexts are different, but I really feel the works of Black vegan activists helped me look at veganism through the lens of rights and intersectionality. And in India, in the mainstream, actually, veganism is often considered like an extension of vegetarianism. And many vegan activists here are also driving this really dangerous narrative, because in India, vegetarianism is very closely related to the caste system, where oppressor caste groups are vegetarian because they are considered the more pure ones, and they really use food as a means for discrimination against oppressed caste folks who consume meat. And like I said, Muslims who are a minority in the country have faced so much violence, like they have been lynched, and they are routinely facing violence for selling or consuming cow meat, or even under the assumption that they are selling cow meat. So, in this kind of a socio-political climate, vegetarianism really does not arise from an animal rights perspective, because um, cows here, for example, there is really a thing here that we call cow vigilantism, that is lynching people for selling or consuming cow meat. But also, cows here are so exploited by the dairy industry, and Hindu vegetarians really consume a lot of dairy. And a lot of Hindu oppressor caste religious practices require the use of dairy. So, this really does not stem from an animal rights concern, vegetarianism, and is really a tool to oppress minorities here. So it's also really appalling that some vegan activists project veganism as just one step ahead of vegetarianism, especially given the casteism and discrimination that is associated with it. So I feel like in India, it is really important for vegan activists to adopt an anti-speciesist approach and to break this vegetarian narrative and the food habit narrative that surrounds veganism. And it's really hard to do this because a lot of prominent vegan activism spaces here, they are dominated by oppressor castes. So intersectional activists receive a lot of flack in these spaces, and we also receive a lot of flack from non-vegans as well. Also, like in my advocacy, I really try to actively recognize that, veganism is about not causing violence and exploitation of non-human animals as much as possible and practicable. And possibility and practicability really differ for different people based on the kind of access they have, their class, disability, and so many other markers. And I feel we really need to acknowledge this and hold space for this diversity in the movement. Otherwise, it will never resonate in the grassroots and will just become another elitist and classist stance. But that being said, India also has like such diverse communities, and we really find a lot of practices and cultures and food that is vegan by default across many local and like indigenous communities, although vegan is not the language that is used to describe it. So I feel it's really important to also reconnect with these local practices in our activism. I don't know if Indian languages have a word for vegan or veganism, but even if not, animal liberation is not a new concept, or like anti-speciesism is not a new concept. It is often rooted in cultural practices as well. And I feel veganism can be approached through these lenses locally, and the movement needs to hold space for different experiences and different realities.
And it's very inspiring to me how you touched on the learning experience from the Black vegans, and how that really inspired how you look at the interconnectedness within India overall, with the caste system and the classism, vegetarianism, and I'm really interested in learning more about how you find the connection between the Black veganism and apply that or use that as a lens to look at the at veganism in India, especially also with how you find the interconnectedness with disability, casteism, culture. And also there is also this privilege that somebody or a group has more over another group. If there are maybe some, yeah, if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I think what really resonates with me from the Black vegan movement is the decolonial approach and the connections that are drawn between the anti-colonial struggle and animal rights. That I feel is a framework or a principle that can be applied in so many different contexts. And I feel intersectional veganism, it needs to be anti-colonial as well. And there is really such a close connection between the anti-colonial struggle and animal rights. And the decolonial approach, it's really an invitation to reconnect with the knowledge and the experience that the colonizers have erased. And it is about reconnecting with ideas of coexistence, self-determination, animal liberation, food justice, that have always existed in very local contexts, in their many different forms and in many different articulations. The decolonial lens, it also asks us to challenge capitalistic and like Eurocentric narratives of veganism that completely dismiss minoritized experiences. Also, recognizing that colonialism doesn't just exploit human lives, but also how animals, their bodies, their lives and spaces, they are commodified, and how they are treated, controlled, or eliminated. And the colonizer has always disrupted local ecosystems, and where they have seen animals as just things that are mass produced resources, and not full and complete beings with autonomy and with rights. So colonialism has always reduced someone's value to what purpose they serve for the colonizer, be it humans or be it non-human animals. So I think intersectional veganism really needs to take this into account, where we cannot be ahistorical and we need to make this connection, because the colonizing of bodies really works in so many different ways. And we see it even when we talk about gender or race or caste. So I think the decolonial framework really can serve as a foundational principle to approach veganism through this lens in many different local contexts as well.
And I see that as well myself as a Palestinian in the way how the Black movement and the Black community is one of the biggest allies and supporters in how they stand up and speak up for Palestine, and also the other communities like in Sudan and Congo. We see how their shared experiences with us, they go beyond the history, and it's our struggles are shared and interconnected in different ways. And I guess the way we address veganism and its intersectionality is a way for us to connect with each other and see how it's not just where you come from or the kind of experiences you think that you alone have been through, but also when you look at things from a wider perspective, and particularly from a vegan lens, things fall into place in how we can't be apolitical or ahistorical or distancing or alienating ourselves from our struggles because this doesn't apply here or there. And particularly with the animal species kind of perspective, and especially what we have been recently, but also like throughout history, we see how the colonizers refer to humans as animals because it's just justifiable to call somebody an animal, and then it's easy to do whatever you think you want to do to them because they're animals, and these are subgroups or they don't have the same value. And I saw how recently some vegans, including yourself, are addressing how using animals' names as descriptions for humans, like rats, like pigs, like donkeys, or other animals, how the use of these names, they use them as insults and as a justification why somebody should be killed or ethnically cleansed or displaced, and the list goes on and on. How do we challenge this language of dehumanization, and particularly in the context of anti-oppression and our call for, the end of genocide, not just in Palestine, but also in other places where, like Sudan and Congo, where humans are undergoing the brutality of white supremacy and capitalism that are in different shapes and forms of occupation.
Yeah, I think it's so important to be it all comes down to being ethically consistent. Like, we cannot be asking others to go vegan and recognize animal rights while being silent about genocide. And especially as vegans around the world, it's like, how do we not see how Israel co-opts animal rights and veganism? Like, they're totally vegan washing this occupation and using words like the most vegan army in the world. Like, what does this even mean when you're committing war crimes and genocide? And I feel like even if vegans only care about animal rights, they need to recognize that genocide is also a multi species massacre where animals are also losing their lives and getting displaced. And Israel has really damaged migratory routes and they have done ecological harm from where there is no coming back. So, how do we not see how all of it is interconnected? And also the narrative where the oppressor, and even in the case of, even in this genocide, we are seeing how they're calling Palestinians animals to justify this. Of course, this is speciesist, but it's also such a genocidal tactic of, saying that they are dangerous or they are threats that we need to eliminate. And it
Mhm.
allows for like, it allows for Palestinian experiences to also be, not counted or be seen as something that is very normal or something that is not tragic at all. And it's just like how non-human animal experiences of violence, of death, are dismissed as something that happens every day and something that we do not need to pay attention to. And it also is such a deliberate tactic to stop paying attention to the ongoing genocide because, oh, they're animals and animal lives are disposable. And it can be really challenging to convince people to see these connections. I get that. But as vegans around the world, it's the least that we can do, in solidarity, keep drawing attention to Palestine, Sudan, Congo, and everywhere that, this is happening in so many different forms, and talk about it and building awareness and counter narratives to these genocidal propaganda. I think it's the least that we can do in solidarity and in allyship.
And you mentioned earlier how in India, for instance, you don't think there is a specific translation for what vegan is or veganism. And I know now that a lot of intersectional vegans who are calling for the end of genocide in Palestine, and they connect the dots between what Israeli occupation is doing and this colonial oppression, how it's dehumanizing sentient beings and sentient lives in Palestine and in other countries, how there are calls to maybe replace the word vegan because it's mostly Eurocentric and stems from a capitalist colonial way of justifying matters, and focuses mostly on consumerism. And we talked about that in other episodes. So in our approach, maybe now that we could replace the word, how do we still find, or how do you still find the knowledge within your community, and you are as well able to educate and share and build advocacy around the causes and the issues that you advocate for?
Yeah, I think regardless of whether we use the word vegan or not, or however we choose to define it, the idea of animal liberation, this is not a new invention. It has always existed in our practices, our cultures, in our politics, in a lot of different ways. And also because minoritized people have been animalized, like we were just discussing. And so these connections have been recognized, across people's experiences in different ways. Probably vegan was not the language it was articulated by. So I think it's important to draw from these experiences and to root it in lived experience and in stories and in socio-political contexts. Um, I don't know if Indian languages have a word for vegan. I know there is a word for vegetarian, which is the same word that is often used for vegan in local contexts here. But I think taking the animal liberation lens and the anti-speciesist lens helps make these connections better, because you are right, veganism, a lot of this vocabulary has come from the West, and mainstream veganism is very it's seen as a consumer activity and something that is not part of local practices. But animal liberation is, and anti-speciesism as an ideology, as a practice, as a political standpoint, very much is a part of um, local context as well. So I think taking that lens to veganism might help make a better connection.
And with that understanding, how what kind of challenges have you faced and maybe continue to face in your advocacy for both animal liberation and human liberation, in particularly in the Palestinian context, and also Sudan and Congo and other oppressed communities across the world?
I think there is this tendency among vegans and vegan activists everywhere to do single issue activism, which in which they really don't hold any space for intersectional narratives, or they ask you to only talk about animal rights and not draw any of these connections. I think that is the one big challenge, is to really convince people to see these different connections. I think with social media also, things become a little easier in some ways, where you can still keep talking about it, and you can, of course, there is so much of censorship and the platforms themselves are genocidal in a lot of ways. But I feel we just need to keep drawing attention to these things, because building these counter narratives is so important. And also being a little strategic about it, seeking out others who are doing similar work, and seeking out other intersectional vegans who are doing this work through a decolonial lens and talking about genocide, and doing things collaboratively also helps shift these narratives.
I recall how this is also the single issue kind of narrative is something also Audre Lorde addressed years ago with there is no
Yeah.
such a thing as a single issue struggle, because we don't live single issue lives. And
Yeah.
with that understanding, everybody should really take their experiences also to look at them from also the lens of the other oppressed people and communities, because we can't just justify what one people are going through because they deserve it or they did something that they have to be treated in a certain way for, or there are some sort of justifications that the colonizers and occupiers are spreading across their platforms to justify what they do. And as you said, yeah, I think social media has been doing the job in two different ways. One is helping amplify the voices of the oppressed and also of the activists who try to build and mobilize and amplify the voices also of the oppressed, but at the same time the shadow banning and the silencing and those quote unquote community standards, they have been playing the role of the colonizer in how they attempt to silence voices that call for freedom and liberation. On these platforms, we also hear the critics who justify and argue that the Palestinian liberation is not really related to veganism, and why are you talking about this, and why you connect veganism with the Palestinian cause. Have you encountered such critics, and if so, how do you respond to them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, in the comment sections or in DMs, I often come across these kind of, thoughts that people have. And even like in India, when you are talking about caste oppression, or when you're trying to make connections with the Palestinian cause, um, you are accused of derailing the vegan movement. But it is really like it is really the opposite, because real transformation cannot come without addressing some of these systemic problems. And I think there is sometimes it's really important to also be mindful of and really choose the kind of audience that you want to interact with, whether they have already, there are so many people who are um, very privileged, but they have made up their mind to do single issue work. And sometimes negotiating with them and doing your advocacy, centering them and trying to make the connection with them, it doesn't work, especially if hold they hold certain identities of privilege, and they cannot make the connection. I think it's important to also be a little strategic and see where you are focusing your work and to whom you are speaking, and do that a little mindfully. This is a question of ethical and ideological consistency, where we cannot be asking people to recognize animal rights while completely ignoring all these other oppressions which oppress both humans and non-human animals. And especially in the case of Palestine, where there is a very deliberate vegan washing of genocide, and this is a tactic that is used. I think it is imperative for vegans around the world to see that and to see the harm in that, and really to build a counter narrative against this genocidal propaganda.
Yeah, that's exactly how we are decolonizing the approach to veganism, basically. And as you said earlier, it's not really a new invention. It's the fact that we also have these discussions around it is our invite to other people as well to reconnect with the knowledge that the colonizers have erased, and how currently we see the ethnic cleansing and the genocide is playing a role in that as well through the vegan washing, but also with the reconnection of the different ideas of anti-speciesism and the caste system, and the different multi-layered oppression systems that we live through. It's important for vegans to connect and look at matters from a true animal liberation and human and non-human liberation perspective, because otherwise we would be simply repetitive, caring only about what really goes on in the plate and what we have on the table, and dismissing the decades longs of struggles of people for the human and the non-human struggles. Do you have a certain message that you wish listeners take from this podcast today, particularly the vegan brown feminists?
Yeah, I think we need to keep talking about interconnected, how oppressions are interconnected, and really make that connection and recognize how minoritized folks are animalized, and why we really need to dismantle the human animal binary. I learn a lot by seeking out other activists who are working relentlessly on this. There is a lot of Instagram pages that I follow and learn from. Vegans for Palestine is one of them. There is also Palestinian Vegan, Plant Based Arab, Apex Advocacy, Dr. Liza Betty, and so many others. And because of social media, in some ways, it has become sort of easier to also seek out ways to support Palestine, and through fundraisers or by amplifying Palestinian voices. There is also a vegan recipe book called Flavors of Freedom that I contributed to along with some other Palestinian vegans and vegans around the world, and it contains almost 30 recipes that are very close to our hearts and cultures. And we, of course, saw the irony of writing a recipe book while so many people in Gaza were starving. But this was like a pragmatic move to raise funds for the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund and Solala Animal Rescue. So these are some projects, that people have done, and it's important to seek these things out if we have the access and, support in whatever way we can.
Debarati, thank you so much for your time and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the lovely conversation.
Can't you hear the urgent call of Palestine? Can't you hear the urgent call of Palestine? Palestine. Tormented, tortured, bruised and battered, and all her sons and daughters scattered. Can't you hear the sweet sad voice of Palestine? Can't you hear the sweet sad voice of Palestine? Palestine. She whispers above the roars of the guns, beckoning to all her daughters and sons. Can't you hear the agony of Palestine? Can't you hear the agony of Palestine? Palestine. Liberation banner, raise it high for Palestine. Let us do or die. Let us heed the urgent call of Palestine. Let us heed